Zephyra slumped forward, her luminous azure hand clutched against her abdomen, crystalline blood seeping between trembling fingers. The Colosseum of Solus thundered with the collective roar of thousands, a physical force pressing down on her shoulders like gravity multiplied. Pulverized silica particles from the arena floor infiltrated the open wound where her palm had been shattered, sending waves of agony through nerve endings never designed for such trauma. Her ceremonial lance lay beside her, once an elegant weapon of her people, now reduced to fragments of alloy and disabled circuitry that occasionally discharged dying pulses of energy. The gleaming fractals that had adorned its shaft now resembled broken promises, much like the oaths of protection she had failed to keep. Zephyra had lost. The knowledge settled into her consciousness with the weight of inevitability. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her final day on Azuria before the hegemony bombardment began. The crystal spires of the Sentinel Academy had shimmered in the light of their binary suns as evacuation vessels launched into the atmosphere. She had been cradling an infant, one of the few survivors from the eastern province. The child's skin had pulsed with the same azure bioluminescence as her own, tiny eyes wide with confusion rather than terror. "We will find sanctuary," she had whispered, knowing even then that her words were hollow. Hours later, hegemony enforcers had torn the child from her arms, clinically noting into their datapads, "Specimen exhibits optimal genetic markers." She had lashed out, shattering an officer's facial structure before being subdued. That defiance had marked her as combat viable, her first step toward the arena. The crowd's roar intensified as the human champion approached. Encased in an exoframe that amplified his already substantial musculature, he moved with predatory assurance, each footfall precise, unhurried, confident in the kill to come. The frame's neural interface nodes pulsed with crimson light along his spine, synchronized with his heartbeat. His execution blade captured the harsh illumination from overhead projectors, casting fractured patterns across the arena floor that danced around her kneeling form. The edge radiated with a distinctive blue-white intensity that spoke of molecular perfection, a weapon designed not for combat, but for efficient termination. Zephyra detected the champion's distinct biochemical signature, the sharp alien scent of human perspiration mingling with the metallic undertones of the exoframe. His respiration followed a practiced rhythm, not from exertion, but from the methodical breathing of one who had performed this duty countless times. No heroics, just execution, she thought. The realization brought an unexpected serenity. No rage pulsed through her circulatory system. No hope flickered in the recesses of her consciousness. Her people believed that in one's final moments, perfect clarity could be achieved. The intricate pattern of existence momentarily revealed in its entirety. She had always dismissed this teaching as spiritual fantasy, yet now, facing her end, she experienced a profound emptiness that somehow approached peace. She sealed her inner eyelids, feeling arena particulates scrape against the sensitive membranes. She would not display fear, though she doubted anyone in the vast amphitheater could discern the subtle differences between terror and resignation on an azure face. The cacophony surrounding her began to diminish, as though she were submerging beneath the surface of Azuria's crystal seas. The champion's regulated breathing, the crowd's bloodthirsty anticipation, the electronic hum of surveillance drones, all receded into distant insignificance. For a heartbeat, all was stillness. Then came a sound that didn't belong, something almost musical in its purity, the distinctive whisper of displaced air. Zephyra opened her eyes just as the execution blade hovered centimeters from her face, close enough that she could see her own distorted reflection in the polished surface. The champion had frozen mid-motion, his expression transitioning from confidence to confusion. Something minute twitched at the junction of his neck and skull, an almost imperceptible movement, and his eyes widened with the sudden cognition that belongs exclusively to the dying. His grip on the blade failed. The weapon fell with a dull impact, embedding itself partially in the arena floor near Zephyra's knee. A crude wooden projectile, handcrafted with stabilizing flights fashioned from scavenged materials, protruded from the base of his cranium. Blood, startlingly crimson against the clinical aesthetics of the Colosseum, began to seep from the wound, tracing thin rivulets down the articulated spine of the exoframe. The champion collapsed forward, narrowly missing Zephyra. The impact raised a small cloud of silica that settled slowly over his motionless form. For the first time in the cycles, perhaps for the first time in the history of the Colosseum, the arena fell completely silent. Thousands of spectators, suspended in collective shock, created a silence so profound it seemed to possess physical weight. Even the electronic hum of the arena system seemed muted, as though the machinery itself were stunned. Zephyra's gaze traced the projectile's trajectory upward, scanning the vast superstructure of the Colosseum. Her vision, evolved for detecting minute movement, registered nothing but the usual security drones and monitoring equipment. Yet somewhere within that labyrinth of composite materials and carbon fiber supports, someone had just altered everything. The silence persisted only moments before chaos erupted. Security alarms blared with piercing intensity. The crowd's shock transformed into panicked discord as spectators stampeded toward the exits. Enforcers in distinctive obsidian armor poured onto the arena floor, weapons raised, forming a perimeter around Zephyra and the fallen champion. But she wasn't extracted from the arena by the enforcers. A firm grip seized her upper arm, pulling her sideways into a maintenance conduit concealed behind a panel that had slid open in the arena wall. The panel sealed behind them, muffling the escalating pandemonium to a distant rumble. Move. The voice was human, urgent, and unexpectedly ordinary. Her rescuer was unremarkable in a way that rendered him functionally invisible, the kind of face that crowds naturally overlooked. He wore a well-worn technician's jumpsuit stained with lubricant and marked with the insignia of Colosseum maintenance. Welding apparatus rested on his forehead, pushing back unkempt brown hair. One cheek exhibited a persistent neuromuscular tic, a rhythmic movement beneath the skin that intensified whenever he glanced toward the sealed panel. "I'm Terran," he said as they moved hurriedly through a narrow passage that carried the distinctive scent of ozone and thermal coolant, the characteristic smell of the Colosseum's infrastructure. Unlike the sleek, antiseptic corridors above, these maintenance tunnels were raw, utilitarian spaces rarely witnessed by anyone outside the technical staff. "Why?" Zephyra managed to ask, her voice raspy from disuse. Prisoners weren't encouraged to vocalize. "Because what they're doing isn't right," he replied, voice low and urgent. "I've been watching. You're the only one who refused to kill when given the opportunity. Third match against the Draxtar prisoner. You had him subdued, bladed his throat. You hesitated." She remembered. The massive four-armed creature had regarded her with unmistakable intelligence, with fear, with a silent plea for mercy. The crowd had demanded execution. She had withdrawn. "I couldn't continue observing without action," Terran continued, guiding her around a junction where coolant vapor escaped from pressure regulation valves. His eyes darted away, something dark passing across his features. "Not after what I've helped construct." "What do you mean?" Zephyra asked. Terran's facial structure tightened. "I designed the atmospheric regulation systems for the laboratories, installed the power distribution networks. I told myself I was simply performing my function, that I wasn't responsible for what occurred behind those sealed chambers." His voice grew bitter. "But the sounds carried through my ventilation systems. I simply chose not to acknowledge them." His hands trembled slightly as he bypassed another security interface. 3 cycles I worked on those systems. 3 cycles of deliberate ignorance until last month, when I discovered a child's artifact in one of the particle filters, a small carved figure resembling one of your people. He glanced at her. That's when I stopped pretending. They navigated deeper into the substructure of the Colosseum through passages that grew increasingly confined and less maintained. Zephyra's damaged hand pulsed with each heartbeat, but she forced herself to maintain pace. Terran navigated the labyrinthine tunnels instinctively, never hesitating at intersections, occasionally pausing to circumvent security measures with practiced efficiency. She didn't trust him, but she followed, too injured to resist, too exhausted to fight. And somewhere beneath the fatigue and pain, curiosity flickered. Why would a human risk everything for an alien prisoner? After what seemed like hours, they reached a small chamber that appeared to be Terran's private workspace. The space was confined but meticulously organized, with tools suspended on wall mounts and components categorized in labeled containers. A compact sleeping platform occupied one corner. Multiple display screens covered one wall, showing various feeds from throughout the Colosseum complex. "Sit," he instructed, indicating the sleeping platform. "Let me examine your hand." Zephyra hesitated, then slowly extended her damaged limb. 3 of her 7 digits had been crushed during the combat. The exterior membrane had fractured, revealing the bioluminescent tissue beneath. Terran examined the wound with clinical detachment, then retrieved a medical kit from beneath a workbench. "I lack medical training," he admitted, "but I've treated enough injuries to understand fundamental procedures. This will cause discomfort." It did cause discomfort, but Zephyra remained silent as he cleaned, repositioned, and dressed her broken digits. When he finished, he offered her a container of water and a nutrient pack, standard arena sustenance, but she hadn't consumed anything in 2 cycles. As she ate, the chamber's entrance hissed open. Zephyra tensed, prepared to defend herself despite her injuries, but Terran raised a hand in reassurance. "It's only Valen," he said. "He's with us." A security enforcer entered, his uniform bearing the insignia of Colosseum Internal Security. He was younger than Terran, with sharp features and alert eyes that quickly assessed Zephyra. "So, this is the fighter," he said, removing his helmet. "Dangerous decision, bringing her here." "Necessary risk," Terran replied. "She's the evidence we require." Valen shrugged. "Your determination, but we need to relocate soon. They're expanding search parameters. Won't be long before maintenance sectors are investigated." He tossed a security access module to Terran. "This will grant you entry to the Eastern Quadrant. I've temporarily disabled surveillance along that route for the next 2 hours. After that, you'll need to proceed independently until my next duty cycle." "Your assistance is appreciated," Terran said. "We won't forget this." After Valen departed, Zephyra asked, "Why assist me?" More directly this time, studying Terran's expressions for deception. Tehran was silent momentarily, his hands methodically returning medical supplies to their designated locations. When he finally answered, his voice had lost its urgency, replaced by something quieter, more resigned. "I maintain environmental systems, repair security barriers, map maintenance conduits. I'm insignificant. That's been my reality throughout my existence." His hands stilled. "My progenitor maintained the Colosseum before me, never questioned anything. When I inherited his position, I followed the same pattern, just kept the systems operational, remained unnoticed." He looked up at her, his gaze suddenly intense. "But then I began noticing inconsistencies, patterns, discrepancies in prisoner manifests, resource requisitions that didn't correspond to the official number of combatants." He moved to the wall of displays, entered a sequence into a control interface. The screens changed, showing archived footage, schematics, data streams. "Observe," he said, indicating a flowchart that appeared on the central display. "Every non-human who passes through the Colosseum system, regardless of victory or defeat, vanishes afterward. Processed, requisitioned. Those are the official designations." Zephyra stood, ignoring the pain that flared through her body, and moved closer to the screens. She examined combat logs, termination reports, facility schematics. A hidden pattern emerged from the seemingly disconnected information, a systematic protocol of elimination. "This isn't merely spectacle," Terran said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a filtering mechanism, a processing facility. They're using the Colosseum to identify specific genetic traits, specific capabilities among non-human species. Those who demonstrate potential are harvested." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and raw. "Why show me this?" Zephyra asked, her mind racing to process the implications. "Because if you vanish, they'll erase even your designation," Terran replied. "They'll erase everything you were, as though you never existed." He paused, then added quietly, "And I can no longer permit that. Not anymore." Zephyra stared at the displays, at the evidence of a system designed to process sentient beings as resources, a system that had nearly claimed her. "What do you require from me?" she asked, turning to face him directly. "Help me expose it," he answered simply. "Help me force everyone to witness the truth." They started with small infiltrations. Terran accessed forgotten communication channels, bypassing security protocols by exploiting maintenance overrides that had remained unupdated for cycles. Zephyra, as her injuries began to heal, utilized her combat training to navigate restricted areas, gathering evidence where Terran couldn't venture. One of their most valuable discoveries came when Zephyra infiltrated a sealed archive containing records dating back to the earliest days of the Colosseum. The files revealed that the facility had originally been designed as a xenobiological research center, supposedly dedicated to understanding and fostering interspecies cooperation. The hegemony had gradually perverted its purpose, transforming scientific inquiry into systematic exploitation. The arena combat had been introduced as a means of evaluating specimen quality before harvesting, entertainment masking atrocity. Terran, meanwhile, had established contact with a network of maintenance workers across multiple hegemony facilities. The corruption, it seemed, extended far beyond a single Colosseum. Similar operations existed on dozens of worlds, all feeding biological material into a central research initiative codenamed Chimera Protocol. The files describe weaponized pathogens designed to target specific genetic markers, biological warfare on an unprecedented scale. One cycle, as she slipped through the prisoner transfer corridor, she heard a struggle in one of the holding cells. Through the narrow observation port, she saw a prisoner, a massive Draxtar warrior with 4 muscular arms, pinning a young human against the wall. The human wore an enforcer's uniform, but would barely post-adolescent, perhaps 16 seasons old. His face blanched with terror as the prisoner's hands tightened around his throat. "They executed my kin cluster," the Draxtar snarled. "Now I take one of theirs." Zephyra didn't hesitate. She overrode the door mechanism and stepped inside. "Release him," she commanded. The Draxtar turned, surprise momentarily superseding rage. "You, the blue fighter, why defend this human spawn?" "He's not your adversary," she said calmly, though her muscles tensed for potential combat. "He's as much a prisoner as you, merely wearing a different restraint." "He guards the path to the death chambers," the Draxtar roared. "He is complicit." The young guard, still pinned to the wall, gasped out words through his constricted airway. "I didn't know what occurred inside. I followed assignment protocols." Zephyra stepped closer. "If you terminate him, you transform into what they desire you to become. A killer, a savage. You validate their propaganda." "Justice demands blood," the Draxtar insisted, but his grip loosened marginally. "Justice demands transformation," Zephyra countered, "and transformation requires witnesses. Allow him to survive and observe what they've perpetrated. Let him become testimony against it." For an extended moment, the Draxtar remained motionless. Then, with a guttural sound of reluctant concession, he released the guard, who collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing. "Your wisdom better justify his continued existence, Blue One," the Draxtar rumbled. Zephyra helped the young guard to his feet. "What's your designation?" "Narek," he replied hoarsely. "Narek, what you've witnessed here, remember it. When the moment of decision arrives, you'll need to determine which path you follow." The youth nodded, his eyes wide with confusion and dawning comprehension. She left them both there, continuing her mission, but the encounter lingered in her thoughts. Transformation would require more than exposing truth. It would necessitate breaking cycles of vengeance, discovering mercy within justified rage. She extracted a memory core from the laboratory section, a minute device containing recorded procedures performed on previous prisoners. The footage was horrific. Surgical interventions conducted on conscious subjects, biological material harvested, test results meticulously documented. "Why?" she asked Terran one cycle after reviewing particularly disturbing footage. "What purpose could this serve?" "Bioweapons," he replied grimly. "Human-specific pathogens engineered using non-human biological templates. The Colosseum helps them identify species with particularly valuable traits: regeneration, toxin production, radiation resistance. They're constructing an arsenal." What Terran didn't tell her immediately, what he revealed only after several more cycles of investigation, was that the bioweapons weren't merely theoretical. The hegemony had already deployed early versions against rebellious outer colonies. Entire settlements had been eradicated, the incidents recorded as natural pathogenic outbreaks in official reports. The casualties numbered in the millions. Cycles passed as they accumulated evidence, reconstructed the truth, and planned its revelation. They alternated rest periods, perpetually vigilant for discovery. During quiet intervals, they learned about each other, not through direct inquiry, but through the natural revelations that emerged from shared purpose. Zafira discovered that Tehran had never terminated a life, never engaged in combat. He was precisely what he appeared, a technician, a systems specialist, someone who comprehended mechanisms and their operations. He possessed an intuition for patterns, for connections others overlooked. She began to recognize the subtle indicators of his anxiety, the increased frequency of his facial tic, the way he reorganized his tools when stressed. One night, as they worked on modifying a broadcast transmitter, Terran revealed more of his past. His parents had been resistance sympathizers during the early days of hegemony expansion. They had been executed for distributing seditious materials, truthful accounts of hegemony aggression on border worlds. Tehran, only 8 seasons old at the time, had been spared but assigned to institutional labor programs. His technical aptitude had eventually brought him to the Colosseum, where his skills were valued even as his spirit was methodically crushed. "I buried myself in systems and circuits," he told her, hands working delicately on the transmitter components. They were predictable, logical. Unlike people, his facial tic intensified as he spoke. "For cycles, I convinced myself that my work was separate from their atrocities, that maintaining air filtration or power distribution didn't make me complicit." His hands stilled. "I was wrong." Terran learned about her world, obliterated in what humans termed a pacification initiative, about her training as a sentinel, a guardian of knowledge, about the oath she had taken never to extinguish life unnecessarily, a vow she had maintained even in the Colosseum, a decision that had ultimately resulted in her defeat. "The Sentinels weren't warriors," she explained as they worked. "We were preservers, keepers of our collective memory, our scientific knowledge, our cultural legacy. Each Sentinel memorized a specific portion of our history or knowledge, becoming a living archive." She touched the intricate patterns of bioluminescence that spiraled across her forearms. "These aren't decorative. They're mnemonic encodings, data storage within living tissue. Even now, I carry the complete astronomical records of the southern hemisphere of Azuria, spanning 2,000 cycles." When they had assembled sufficient evidence, they created a single recording. Silent predominantly, just faces, fear, quiet dignity confronting horror. The reality of the Colosseum, stripped of spectacle and revealed as industrialized extermination. At the conclusion, Zephyra gazed into the lens, her large eyes reflecting the recording light, and said, "You witness us now. Choose." 4 words, a challenge and a plea. The day of transmission arrived, the day of the champion ceremony when the new Colosseum champion would descend to claim the ceremonial weapons of his position. The entire complex would be observing, from the lowest maintenance worker to the highest hegemony official. It represented their only opportunity to reach everyone simultaneously. Turan's hands trembled slightly as he connected the final circuits of their improvised transmitter. "Once I activate this sequence, there's no returning to our previous existence," he said. "If we fail, we're already condemned," Zafira completed for him. "We were condemned the moment you extracted me from the arena." He nodded, inhaled deeply, and initiated the activation sequence. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the displays around them flickered, showing the main arena where the ceremony was commencing. The massive viewing screens surrounding the Colosseum floor momentarily darkened as their signal intercepted the broadcast system. But instead of combat, instead of the pageantry and ritual of the champion ceremony, the screens displayed corpses, dozens of broken azure bodies, Zafira's people arranged on laboratory tables, clinical images of dissection and extraction, footage of living subjects undergoing procedures without anesthesia. For the first time, the spectators witnessed that their entertainment was an execution facility, that the spectacle they celebrated concealed a horror beyond imagination. "It's functioning," Terran whispered, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. "Observe. They're witnessing it. All of them." On the screens, they could see the crowd's reaction. Shock, confusion, growing horror. Hegemony officials scrambling to regain control of the broadcast system. Enforcers appearing uncertain, some lowering their weapons as they stared at the images. "We've succeeded," Saphira said, allowing herself a moment of hope. "They can no longer conceal it." Terran's communication panel illuminated with incoming signals. "Others are joining our effort. Maintenance crews from the lower levels, even some security personnel. They're providing access to restricted areas." For a brief, exhilarating moment, it seemed the entire system was crumbling under the weight of revealed truth. Zephyra and Tehran exchanged a look of cautious triumph. Then, without warning, every screen darkened. The communication panel fell silent. The emergency illumination in their hideout flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "What happened?" Saphira asked, her natural bioluminescence providing the only light in the chamber. Terran frantically manipulated the inactive panel. "It's not merely our transmission. It's everything. They've initiated a complete system shutdown. They're willing to dispo the entire complex just to stop us." "Can you restore functionality?" "Not from this location. We would need to." The entrance to their hideout slid open, revealing Valen silhouetted against the emergency illumination of the corridor. Behind him stood a squad of Hegemony security forces in full tactical equipment. "I warned you it was hazardous," Valen said, his voice emotionless. "Should have remained with your systems, Terran." "You," Terran breathed, realization and betrayal washing over his features. "You triggered the shutdown." Valen shrugged. "The Hegemony rewards loyalty and punishes traitors." He stepped aside, gesturing to the security team. "They're at your disposal. The Overseer wants them alive for public execution." The betrayal struck Zephyra with physical force. Valen had been their ally, their informant, the one who had provided access codes and security schedules. His treachery hadn't merely endangered them, it had compromised their entire network of sympathizers throughout the complex. As the security team advanced, weapons raised, Zephyra's combat training surfaced. She assessed angles, vulnerabilities, potential improvised weapons. But the odds were overwhelming. 6 heavily armored enforcers in a confined space, with Valen blocking the only exit. "I'm sorry," Terran whispered beside her, despair evident in his voice. "I trusted him." "Trust wasn't your error," she replied quietly. "Believing they would permit truth to exist was." Panic erupted immediately throughout the Colosseum. Enforcers rushed to terminate the broadcast feeds, but Terran had anticipated this, activating backup nodes throughout the complex that continued the transmission. Hegemony officials barked orders, attempting to maintain control of the escalating situation. The crowd remained frozen, their celebratory atmosphere transformed into shock, then revulsion. Then someone, a maintenance worker in the lower seating tiers, threw their weapon onto the arena floor. The impact echoed in the sudden hush. "Traitor!" A Hegemony officer's voice cut through the silence. He drew his sidearm and fired. The maintenance worker collapsed, a cauterized aperture in their chest smoking slightly. The crowd gasped collectively. For a moment, it seemed the rebellion would terminate before it began. Then a woman in arena security uniform stepped forward. She regarded the fallen worker, then the officer, her expression set in grim determination. Slowly, deliberately, she removed her helmet and dropped it. Then her weapon followed, clattering beside the first. The officer redirected his weapon toward her. "The next one dies too," he shouted, his voice echoing across the now silent arena. The woman didn't flinch. She simply stood, unarmed, waiting. The officer's finger tensed on the trigger mechanism. Another weapon clattered to the ground, then another and another. Like precipitation, they began to fall. Dozens, then hundreds of weapons discarded by guards, workers, and spectators alike. Each person who disarmed themselves stood erect, eyes fixed on the officer, choosing sacrifice over complicity. The officer lowered his weapon, overwhelmed by the silent wave of defiance. Meanwhile, deep in the maintenance levels, Zephyra made her move. As the security team advanced into Terran's workspace, she triggered the emergency ventilation protocol that Terran had modified. Instantly, the chamber flooded with dense, obscuring vapor. In the momentary confusion, she seized Terran's arm and pulled him toward a concealed access panel he had shown her, an emergency escape route he had prepared for precisely this contingency. But the others, he protested as she forced him through the narrow opening. The network. They knew the risks, she replied, following him into the cramped maintenance shaft. Now they need us to survive. Valen's enraged shouts echoed behind them as they crawled through the tight passage, emerging 2 levels below in an auxiliary power distribution node. Alarms blared throughout the complex. Emergency protocols had sealed most regular access routes, but Terran's intimate knowledge of the Colosseum's infrastructure provided alternative pathways. We need to reach the central processing hub, he said, orienting himself in the dimly lit corridor. If we can access the primary systems, we might still complete the transmission to the external network. Zephyra and Terran observed from their hidden position, scarcely breathing as the transformation they had initiated began to unfold. But their triumph was momentary. The entrance to their hideout burst inward, knocked from its mounting by armored security forces. They poured into the small space, weapons raised. Behind them stood a tall figure in the ornate uniform of Colosseum Command, Overseer Gaius himself, his features contorted with rage. "Traitors," he spat, signaling his enforcers. The guards moved with brutal efficiency. Zephyra fought, but her injuries hadn't fully healed, and she was quickly subdued. Terran never had an opportunity to resist. A neural disruptor to his back incapacitated him instantly. They were dragged from their Fiedishbad through the maintenance tunnels and up to the arena floor. The screens still displayed their transmission, though technicians worked frantically to regain control of the system. The crowd, now restless and uncertain, watched as Zephyra was forced to her knees. Terran was positioned beside her, blood flowing from a laceration above his eye. Before them stood the Colosseum's overseer, his ceremonial blade etched with ancient symbols of office. He elevated it slowly above Terran's neck, his voice carrying across the now silent arena. For disrupting order, for treason, for deception, the sentence is termination. Zephyra struggled to her feet, pain radiating through her body. Luminescent blood dripped from her split lip, glowing faintly with the bioluminescence characteristic of her species. "He is human," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The overseer paused, blade still raised. "Yes, a traitor to his kind." "No." Zephyra stood straighter, facing him directly. "He represents the best among you." The overseer's face twisted into a contemptuous expression. "Sentiment," he sneered, raising the sword higher, preparing for the killing stroke. But again, a whisper through the air, an arrow, straight and precise. It struck the blade from the overseer's hand with impossible accuracy, sending it spinning across the arena floor. Everyone turned toward the projectile's origin, on a structural support high above the arena floor. A child, a human boy no more than 12 seasons old, balanced precariously on the narrow beam. He held a makeshift bow fashioned from composite piping and maintenance wire, already knocking another arrow. Zephyra examined the arrows in his quiver more closely. They weren't simply handcrafted. They were fashioned from components of the Colosseum itself. Fragments of the ceremonial platform, shards of damaged arena barriers, even what appeared to be pieces of prisoner restraints, all transformed into instruments of liberation. "I witnessed their transmission," he called down, his voice youthful but unwavering. "I'm human too, and I refuse to remain silent." The overseer snarled an order to his guards, indicating the boy. Before they could raise their weapons, another arrow struck the ground at their feet. "Consider that a warning," the boy called. "You possess energy weapons and neural disruptors," Zephyra called out, finding strength in the boy's courage. "We have wood and wire, but our aim is truer because we fight for truth." In that moment of hesitation, something in the crowd shifted, a murmur that grew to a roar. People began to move, not away from the arena as before, but toward it. Workers, attendants, even some lower-ranking enforcers poured onto the arena floor. Chaos erupted, but unlike most uprisings, the crowd didn't retreat from danger. They advanced toward it. They surrounded Zephyra and Terran, forming a protective barrier between them and the overseer's forces. Throughout the complex, containment cells opened. Prisoners emerged, weaponless but no longer intimidated. Many were injured, weakened by their captivity, but they moved with the desperate energy of those with nothing remaining to lose. Terran, still dazed from the neural disruptor, but conscious, began organizing the resistance. His knowledge of the Colosseum's systems proved invaluable. He directed groups to secure key access points, disable security measures, and liberate additional prisoners. The corridors became fragmented battlegrounds. Not all the freed prisoners followed Zephyra's example of restraint. Near one of the security checkpoints, a massive reptilian prisoner had cornered a group of young enforcers. "Betrayers deserve extinction," he growled, advancing on the terrified guards who had discarded their weapons in surrender. His claws, evolved for penetrating dense vegetation on his homeworld, proved equally effective against body armor and flesh. "Stop!" Zephyra inserted herself between the prisoner and his intended victims. They surrendered. They chose to cease fighting. "They showed no mercy to my nest cluster," the reptilian hissed, his dermal plates flaring with rage. "Why should I demonstrate mercy toward them?" "Because we must transcend their methods," she answered, refusing to yield. "Or we merely substitute one cruelty with another." For a tense moment, it seemed the prisoner would attack her as well. Then slowly his dermal plates settled. "What would you have me do with them?" "Confine them. Treat them as we wish we had been treated," she said. "Let them witness what justice truly resembles." The reptilian growled but nodded, directing the guards to a storage chamber rather than executing them. As they moved away, Zephyra noticed Terran observing from nearby, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "Not everyone will respond to reason," he said quietly as she approached. "Then we persist until they do," she replied. "Or what purpose does any of this serve?" Their conversation was interrupted as an explosion reverberated through the corridor. Hegemony reinforcements had breached one of the barricades. The conflict was far from concluded. Zephyra took a step forward but faltered suddenly, her injuries and exhaustion finally overwhelming her. Terran caught her before she collapsed, supporting her weight against his side. "I can proceed independently," she insisted, though her limbs trembled with fatigue. "Not alone," he replied simply. He adjusted his position, bearing more of her weight. "I won't permit you to fall." For a moment, she allowed herself to lean against him. This human who had risked everything for a principle. There was trust in the gesture, not just in his intentions, but in his strength, in his willingness to share her burden. It wasn't romantic or sentimental. It was survival, partnership, the fundamental truth that neither would succeed independently. She nodded once, and together they moved toward the sounds of conflict, each supporting the other's steps. Their final confrontation occurred in the heart of the Colosseum. The hegemony forces, regrouping after the initial shock, had deployed reinforcements. Armored soldiers with energy weapons formed a perimeter, gradually constricting around the rebellion. Terran led a group that had managed to access the Colosseum's environmental controls, creating zones of impenetrable darkness, flooding sections with harmless but disorienting vapor. Zephyra coordinated the prisoners, utilizing their diverse capabilities to maximum advantage. Species that could perceive in darkness became guides. Those with natural armor formed protective formations. But despite their efforts, they were being forced back. Zephyra found herself once again in the center of the arena, defending a group of wounded rebels as hegemony forces closed in. She fought with desperate intensity, but she was singular against many. And again, a strike to her injured hand sent waves of agony up her arm. She dropped to one knee, momentarily vulnerable. A hegemony officer stepped forward, raising his blade above her. Again, a blade hovered above her. But this time, something differed. The boy with the bow had descended from the superstructure and was now fighting alongside the rebels. He had depleted his arrows but still carried his makeshift bow. As Zephyra knelt, defenseless, he threw the bow to her, a gesture of desperate hope. She caught it with her uninjured hand. In that moment, time seemed to decelerate. She observed the blade beginning its downward arc, saw the bow in her hand, noticed an abandoned arrow embedded in a nearby barrier. With one fluid motion, she extracted the arrow, knocked it, and drew back the bowstring. But now an arrow, the third, this time hers, released by her own hand. The projectile struck the officer in the shoulder, a disabling shot, not a lethal one. He staggered backward, dropping his weapon, regarding her with shock. The momentary interruption provided the rebels the opening they required. They surged forward, overwhelming the remaining hegemony forces through sheer numerical advantage. The battle for the Colosseum complex continued for days. Hegemony reinforcements arrived, but found themselves confronting not just escaped prisoners and rebellious workers, but an increasing number of citizens who had witnessed the broadcast and chosen their allegiance. The truth once revealed could not be contained. As the rebellion spread, it encountered unexpected allies. Merchant vessels from neutral systems, learning of the uprising, began delivering supplies and volunteers. Several prominent hegemony scientists, long uncomfortable with the direction of their research, defected with valuable data on the bioweapon program, information that would prove crucial in the development of countermeasures. Most significantly, the transmission had reached other hegemony worlds. Reports filtered in of similar uprisings at facilities across controlled space. The Colosseum rebellion had ignited something far larger than anyone had anticipated. A cascading system failure in the mechanisms of oppression. 7 cycles after the initial transmission, the final hegemony stronghold within the city surrendered. The complex that had housed the Colosseum was no longer controlled by the hegemony. Terran recuperated in a makeshift medical facility, recovering from injuries sustained during the final assault. Zephyra sat beside him, her own wounds dressed but healing. They had barely communicated since the fighting concluded, both too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what they had initiated. "We succeeded," he said finally, his voice weary but satisfied. "No," she answered, looking toward the aperture where natural illumination streamed in. Real sunlight, not the artificial illumination of the Colosseum. "It's merely beginning." She stood, moving stiffly but with purpose, and made her way outside. A crowd had assembled in the plaza before the former Colosseum complex. Thousands of beings, human and non-human alike, waiting in the bright morning light. Zephyra hesitated at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed. Her hand, the one that had been shattered in the arena, now healed but still bearing the evidence of that conflict, began to tremble. These people were looking to her for guidance, for direction, for hope. What did she know of reconstructing worlds? She had been a sentinel, a protector, then a prisoner, not a leader. Her respiration accelerated, grew shallow. The weight of expectation pressed down upon her like the arena crowd's roar once had. She felt contact on her wrist, Turin standing beside her, his expression showing concern. "I can't fulfill this role," she whispered, too quietly for anyone but him to hear. "I'm not what they believe me to be." "You already selected your path," he said, his fingers gently steadying her trembling hand. "When you refused to kill in the Colosseum, when you fought to protect others instead of yourself, when you released that arrow." His eyes held hers. "You don't need perfection. You need authenticity. Tell them what you've already demonstrated to us." She inhaled deeply, feeling the tremor in her hand beginning to subside under his touch. "You chose," he said simply. "Now help them choose too." Zephyra nodded, straightening her posture. She walked to the center of the plaza. The crowd parted for her, falling silent as she passed. She stopped at a small elevated platform that had been constructed overnight and slowly ascended the steps. For a moment, she simply observed the assembled faces, former prisoners, maintenance workers, citizens who had joined the rebellion, even some former guards who had discarded their weapons when the truth was revealed. Then she raised an arrow, one of the wooden projectiles that had initiated everything. "This isn't a weapon," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed plaza. "It's a symbol, a reminder that the smallest action at the precise moment can transform everything." She lowered the arrow, looking directly into the crowd. "We are not resources. We are alive, all of us, regardless of our origins, regardless of our differences. The hegemony classified some of us as specimens to be harvested, others as tools to be utilized. They were mistaken." Her voice strengthened. "And I remember everyone who returned to the cosmic dust, those who perished in the Colosseum, those who were taken to the laboratories, those who never received designations in hegemony records. We will honor them all, not as monuments or memorials, but in the civilization we construct now, a civilization where such atrocities can never recur." The crowd remained silent momentarily, then erupted in a sound that was neither celebration nor applause, but something deeper, a collective affirmation, a promise. A cycle after the uprising, the planet officially changed its designation. No longer Solus, a classification that reduced an entire world to its function within the hegemony system. Now it was Nova Libertas, named for the freedom that had been reclaimed. In the central plaza of the capital city, where once the Colosseum had dominated the skyline, a memorial was to be dedicated. Thousands gathered in the bright morning light, former prisoners, maintenance workers, citizens who had joined the rebellion, even former guards who had discarded their weapons when the truth was revealed. Zephyra stood at the periphery of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, yet understanding the necessity of ritual. Terran stood beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. "They're waiting for you," he said softly. She nodded but didn't move, observing the assembled faces, human and non-human alike, united in something beyond mere survival. "Azuria is lost," she said suddenly. "The hegemony ensured that. But if even one of my people survived, dispersed across refugee worlds or concealed in distant settlements, I'm obligated to locate them." Her eyes adopted a determined intensity. "We were the custodians of our civilization's knowledge. If I'm the last, then I carry everything we were," she continued. "But if others exist, when you depart," he replied, "I would accompany you." She turned to regard him, this unremarkable human who had transformed everything. His neuromuscular tic persisted, though less pronounced now. His hands, once stained with mechanical lubricant, now bore the evidence of reconstruction work. He had helped rebuild what had been dismantled. "Why?" she asked, echoing the question she had first posed in the maintenance tunnel beneath the Colosseum. He smiled slightly, because certain journeys shouldn't be undertaken alone. The crowd had grown silent, observing and waiting. A small figure detached from the mass of people and approached Zephyra, a human girl, perhaps 10 seasons old, her attire simple but immaculate. In her hands she carried something wrapped in fabric. The child stopped before Zephyra and carefully unwrapped her burden. It was an arrow, handmade with uneven carving along its shaft. The wood originated from a root system, twisted but resilient. The fletching had been fashioned from fabric torn from what appeared to be a cherished garment. "I don't possess combat skills," the girl said, her voice clear in the silence. "But I created this for you." She extended the arrow. "It ascends rather than strikes." A pause, then with childlike directness, "Like you." Zephyra knelt, bringing herself to the child's eye level. She accepted the arrow, examining it with sensitive fingers, feeling the textured imperfections of amateur craftsmanship, the sincerity in every flaw. "Thank you," she said simply. She rose and surveyed the waiting crowd. Before her stood the entire spectrum of sentient existence. Humans in their diversity, reptilian species with dermal plates catching the sunlight, azure-skinned beings like herself, mechanically augmented technicians, children who had never experienced the Colosseum, soldiers who had discarded their uniforms, all waiting, all choosing. Silently, Zephyra approached the center of the plaza where a simple pedestal stood. She positioned the arrow at its center, orienting it to indicate skyward. Terran approached, carrying a minute package wrapped in preservation film. "We documented the designations," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed plaza. "Everyone who fell, those we couldn't locate, those who never returned from the Colosseum." He carefully unwrapped a small scroll densely covered with microscopic notation. Thousands of names, each representing a life, a loss, a memory. He placed it in a notch carved into the arrow shaft. Zephyra secured it with a binding cord, her movements deliberate and reverent. Then she stepped back, creating space for what would follow. The boy with the bow, the one who had released the shot that initiated everything, stepped forward. His clothes bore evidence of reconstruction efforts, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. In his hands was the same makeshift bow fashioned from composite materials that had altered the trajectory of their world. He knocked the arrow to the bowstring. The crowd observed in perfect silence as he drew back, his young face solemn with understanding beyond his seasons. "For each who returned to cosmic dust," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. He released. The arrow soared upward, straight, true, climbing higher than seemed possible from such a simple implement. It rose above the spires of the rebuilt city, above the orbiting satellites, into the perfect azure of morning. And as the solar illumination caught its tip, the arrow shone, incandescent, transcendent. For a breathless moment, the arrow was the only star in the daylit sky. Zephyra watched its ascent, her gaze following until the arrow vanished completely. In that moment, she felt a connection to something larger than herself, a thread in a tapestry just beginning to take shape. The arrow's flight represented both an ending and a beginning, a memorial and a promise. In the days that followed, the first interstellar transmissions from Nova Libertas were sent, broadcasts carrying the truth about the hegemony's bioweapon program, the exploitation in the Colosseums, and the testimony of survivors. The signals radiated outward at the speed of light, reaching distant worlds one by one. Some responded immediately, others maintained silence. But the truth continued its relentless expansion. 3 cycles later, as preparations for their expedition were nearly complete, Terran brought Zephyra to a small communications facility on the outskirts of the city. His facial tic was more pronounced than she had seen it in some time, a sign of significant anxiety. "We received a transmission," he said, leading her to a private terminal. It originated from the Mira system at the edge of former hegemony space. "What does it contain?" she asked, noting his unusual agitation. "A response to our broadcast." He activated the terminal. "From someone claiming to be Azurian." Her bioluminescence flared involuntarily as the message appeared on the screen, a series of intricate patterns and glyphs in the ancient, scholarly notation of the Sentinel Order. A form of communication known only to fully trained sentinels. "They're alive," she whispered, her fingers tracing the symbols on the display. "My people. Some of them survived." Terran watched her, his own expression a mixture of happiness and something more complex. "The expedition has a destination now," he said quietly. She turned to him, suddenly understanding his anxiety. "You still wish to accompany me?" "If you'll have me," he replied, "though I understand if you prefer to reunite with your people alone." Zephyra studied him, this human whose unremarkable appearance concealed remarkable courage, whose seemingly ordinary life had altered the course of worlds. The man who had seen her not as a specimen, not as a fighter, but as a person worthy of risk and sacrifice. "Certain journeys shouldn't be undertaken alone," she said, echoing his earlier words. "And this journey began with both of us." In the hangar bay where their small exploration vessel waited, final preparations were underway. The craft, renamed Libertas in honor of their new world, had been retrofitted with advanced communication systems capable of detecting even the faintest Azurian signals. As they supervised the loading of supplies, Narek, the young guard whose life Zephyromin had saved, approached. He had abandoned his enforcer uniform, now wearing the practical attire of a volunteer relief worker. "I heard you're departing," he said, his voice stronger than when they had first met. "To search for survivors." "We are," Zephyra confirmed. "I'd like to contribute." He extended a small data crystal, maps of restricted zones in the outer systems, places the hegemony designated as quarantine sectors. They might be sanctuary locations. Terran accepted the crystal, examining it briefly before securing it in a pocket. "This could prove invaluable. Thank you." Narek nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "When you find them, tell them not all of us knew. Tell them some of us chose differently when we learned the truth." "They'll know," Zephyra assured him, "just as we know." As they completed final preparations for departure, Zephyra stood at the observation port, gazing across the city that had once been a place of death and was now becoming something new. Construction crews were dismantling the last remnants of the Colosseum structure, repurposing the materials for community centers, medical facilities, and educational institutions. "Ready?" Terran asked, joining her at the viewport. She nodded, watching as a group of children, human and non-human alike, played in a newly established park where once the Colosseum's administrative complex had stood. One child looked up, noticed them watching, and raised a hand in farewell. "Not an ending," Zephyra said softly, "a beginning." Together they turned toward the ship that would carry them beyond the horizon, into the vastness where scattered survivors awaited discovery. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the unknown, but they faced it not as savior and saved, not as human and alien, but as partners forged in the crucible of shared purpose. The arrow had shown the way. Now they would follow.